Windhorse is our innate ability to uplift ourselves and our environment by giving rise to a positive energy that is both relaxed and disciplined. Since 1981, Windhorse Community Services has integrated this understanding with modern conventional therapies, meditation, and contemplative traditions in the development of at-home, whole-person mental health recovery. Windhorse Journal is dedicated to the mission of communicating decades of clinical and personal experience to professionals, educators, students, and anyone seeking recovery options. Please join the dialogue.
Welcome to Windhorse Journal Entry 75. Could I be a voice for those still suffering? This is part 2 of a 5-part series, where we once again join the 4 members of Julia's long-standing Windhorse team as they continue to discuss their experiences. Please note that this conversation covers the topic of cutting and may at times be challenging to hear. Thank you for listening.
Welcome everyone to the Windhorse Journal. I'm your host, Chuck Knapp, and I'm so pleased and honored to be presenting today's podcast, a conversation with a former team about the completely remarkable recovery journey they shared. We're joined today by our dear friend and former client, Julia, and by Janalee Chapin and Jack Gipple, who were her primary team members. So, Julia, you talked about this in your book. I think it would be really, again, very helpful to clarify for people what is really important to understand about how cutting functioned as part of your life.
Cutting was a huge part of my life for a long time. It took over my life. Started in the hospital, but it became, I don't even know how to follow what happened, but cutting became something that I relied on. I remember carrying razor blades with me everywhere I went. I carried razor blades in my pocket. I hid razor blades in my house in an old bathrobe, wrapped in old tissues, old, dirty, bloody razor blades that I never washed. It was not only cutting, but I wanted to not only cut myself, but I wanted to do it with razor blades that were dirty and contaminated. So it was more than cutting. It was going to get infected, which I did. I actually one time developed cellulitis from one of the razor blades, and was in the hospital with cellulitis and a temperature of almost 106 for days from a contaminated razor blade. Cutting just became, I don't know, everything. All I thought about, it kind of took over my life. It was a very hard thing to explain. I don't know what happened with that. It was never really a suicidal thing. I don't know how to explain it. It was always something I could do. Somebody could always be in charge of pills, but I could always be in charge of razor blades. Somebody found them, I could go to a drugstore and buy more. I don't know, I felt in control of very little in my life. Razor blades I could be in control of.
Remember, as a big deal later with Dr. Green. You had this stash of razor blades, and I remember you kind of let us know that it was there. It was important that I remember you let me know it was there. You let Dr. Green know. But nobody was going to ever get it from you. It was never going to be. And I remember at some point you brought them in to Dr. Green. Isn't that right?
Always. I very frequently did that. He didn't know, but yeah, I did very frequently. It was like a safety device for me.
So it wasn't just one time you brought them in, you took it in. Is that right?
Very frequently. I rarely told him about it. I know I did tell him once because he called 911, or he said he was going to, if I didn't give him the razor blades. But most of the time I didn't tell him about it. I don't know, I somehow needed to have the option of cutting myself if I wanted to.
Being able to control one aspect of your life seemed like an important thing.
It did.
Yeah.
And it was also more than control. It was a way of helping me deal with pain that I couldn't deal with.
Mm-hmm.
When things were more than I could tolerate, cutting helped me to deal with that.
So I just really have another question right there on when the pain would build up to a place where you couldn't tolerate it. As much as it sounded like you were obsessionally thinking about cutting, you didn't do it 10 times a day.
No, I didn't. No.
So there were events that led up to and a process that would lead up to a cutting event. And I'm just curious if you describe how you understand that now.
It was a very strange thing that happened with cutting. I remember when I started to have a lot of whatever kind of pain I was in, and I would get the idea that I needed to cut. Once that idea entered my mind, there was no stopping it. Once I started to think that I'm going to cut myself, there was no stopping it. Nobody could talk me out of it. I couldn't talk myself out of it. It was going to happen, and I knew that. And that was very scary to me because I knew that I couldn't stop it. Once that thought got into my mind, I couldn't stop it. And so I remember a lot of times I felt very unsafe, and it scared me. And I remember lots of times going and sitting in Dr. Green's waiting room for hours. He knew I was there. I just needed to sit there because I felt safe, and I knew I wouldn't do anything as long as I was sitting there. And he knew I was there. He was seeing other patients, and he would come out and say hi in between patients, and he would ask me if I needed to go to the hospital and whatever. But I just needed to be close to him, and I needed to be there because I felt safe. And then when I felt better, I could go home. But I knew that I knew what I needed to stop myself from doing something. Because I knew I wouldn't be able to stop myself if I, just went home.
Mm-hmm. Did you typically do your cutting often was very severe, and did you often or typically do it at times when you knew that there was safety at hand?
No, I I didn't. I usually did it alone in my house. I always cut myself in my house. Um, and I would decide if I needed to go to the hospital or not. I decided what I needed to do. Sometimes I knew that if I didn't, I would bleed to death, and I probably would have.
Do you remember, Julia, when there was a time where you cut in the bathroom of the ER?
Yes, I do. Uh, that was probably the worst I had ever cut myself. I planned to go to the hospital. I knew that I was going to cut myself um, and possibly die from the cut. And so I dreamt up this whole scenario of what I was going to do. And I wrapped up the razor blades. I called a taxi. I planned the whole thing out. I went into the bathroom at the hospital. I remember that someone was in the bathroom in the emergency room. There was someone in the bathroom, and I was so upset because I had to wait, and waiting was just so difficult. Eventually, the person went out, and I went into the bathroom, and I had everything with me, the razor blades, everything. And I cut myself so badly. The bathroom was just covered with blood, covered, spouting arteries. I mean, it was so severe. And people were knocking on the door. Patients were wanting to use the bathroom in the emergency room. People were knocking on the door, and I, needed to finish what I was doing. And then I wrapped myself up and ran out of the bathroom. And of course, people went in and started screaming. The bathroom was covered with blood, and then I was in the emergency room. I was already where I needed to be. So.
My memory is that happened right before I joined the team. Were you working with Jan Lee by that time? It would have been very early in the team.
It's very early. I don't think so. Do you remember, Jan Lee? I don't think so.
I don't remember. I mean, I remember that happening, but I don't remember when. I also remember you going out into the parking lot once they sewed you up, and then you ripped the stitches out and had to go back. I don't know if that was the same incident or a different one. Feeling the intensity of that.
Yeah.
Feeling very worried for you, about you.
Yeah. I also went to my doctor's office, my medical doctor's office, and stole razor blades from his office, from the drawer, where they had medical supplies.
And the time you stole the scalpel?
The scalpel, that was years later. I did that.
And you wanted to find that nurse that really caused harm to you.
Oh, I was not trying to hurt her. I was trying to hurt me.
Yeah.
I wasn't trying to.
My memory is not.
Cut her. I cut myself. Yeah.
Let me ask a question here. Generally, or just a second ago, generally, when you were talking about the intensity of this, I mean, I can feel it right now. Just, how many years later, the imagination, the kind of courage and the discipline, and also the total lack of logic that was here in any conventional sense about how the cutting worked for you. At the same time, it was helping with your pain. It got very dramatic at times, and like you said, you weren't trying to kill yourself, but it became life-threatening at certain points.
It did become life-threatening.
Yeah.
I actually cut so deep that they were concerned that I had cut organs in my abdomen, and took x-rays to see if, or some kind of scans of some kind to see if I cut organs, because it was so deep.
Yeah. So, Julia, the emergency services that you were naturally involved with at this point, how did they understand what was going on with you, and did you feel like they were equipped psychologically to help you?
No. I think the first couple of times that I went to the emergency room, nurses were not unkind. I think they were kind of shocked. I don't think that they had dealt with that before, and they didn't really know how to deal with it. It was kind of shocking. I was gaping, these huge gaping wounds, and I think it was kind of a shocking thing to see, to know that I had done it willingly to myself, and I think they just weren't really sure how to deal with that. But after I had come back repeatedly, people started getting angry and nasty. And I remember one triage nurse, you weren't really back away from other patients. You were kind of in this triage area where there were patients, but the nurse was kind of checking you in, so to speak. And she asked me to take off my shirt so she could look at the cut. And there were other patients there. And I was just devastated and humiliated that I had to do that with all of these people there. And I'm sure that she did that because of her anger and frustration. And it was mean. I think that they had gotten to the point where they didn't know what to do, and they were not trained to deal with that. And that kind of cutting is hard to look at, and it was hard for them to deal with. It was hard for me to deal with.
Yeah. This is the piece where I feel like stigma comes into the picture in terms of clinicians having a particular view of a patient, this patient who keeps coming back over and over, and their frustration with that. And maybe you have a label of borderline personality or bipolar or whatever, and that's all in the picture as well. And I feel like that's where clinicians' hearts start to shut down, because they're overworked, they're underpaid, probably all these different pieces that happen within the system, but then you end up paying the price of that, or feeling that, because they are having such a hard time managing their own intensity, because they don't have the space to do it, especially in an ER. But then you wind up feeling their aggression toward you, by asking you to derobe or take your shirt off in front of a bunch of people around, and kind of that shaming quality. I don't know if that resonates with you, but that's how I see it.
It's really true. I think that, in a way, I almost have to feel some compassion for them. I think that I was really hard to deal with, and I don't think that they were trained. There were a lot of psychiatrists who couldn't deal with all the things that I was doing, And these nurses in the ER, I mean, they did some very terrible things to me. They would put me in a seclusion room in the ER, and all of these patients would be, and patients' families would be walking by and looking in the window. And I would be in there, you know, with this little nothing gown sitting on a mattress, and people would be walking by and looking in like I was in a zoo, and they would be looking at me, people's families. Mm-hmm. And I remember one person asking a nurse or a nurse's aide, I don't know, someone who worked there, why is she in there? You know, what is she doing in there? And this person said, oh, she's here all the time. She's a regular. And I felt so terrible. It was just incredibly humiliating experience for me. Not only that people could just walk by and look at me, and I was just sitting there, you know, with this tiny little thing on, and people were looking at me through this window like I was some kind of a, you know, animal on display. It was just horrifying. I mean, those are memories that I'll never forget. They were so traumatic. And these were in places that I went to get help. And people were just terrible. They treated me terribly.
Yeah, it's unfortunate, the compassion fatigue, if you will, of the clinicians, you know, that they had to resort to those kind of ways of managing you, you know, or working with their own issues around power. And, yeah.
I think power, I think that's a big word. Mm-hmm. You know, it's a big word. I remember once in the emergency room, I don't know, I was in the emergency room a lot. I had overdosed a lot and cut a lot. And so I was there all the time for one thing or another. And I remember one time they wanted me to give a urine sample and, you know, to go on a bedpan. And I asked if there could be a female nurse because I had basically no clothes on and I was humiliated. And they just were so mean. They just said, well, this male nurse or whoever he was said, well, if you don't go, I'm going to catheterize you. Right. And I mean, it was just so, they were so mean. They did things that were just so unnecessarily mean. And was it out of anger because I was there so much? I was there because I didn't want to be there. I would have been very happy not to be in that kind of a situation. But they were just very mean to me, repeatedly, over and over again.
And I think you're talking, it wasn't just the ER, it was also the locked psych unit, is that right?
That in the unit, I often didn't even have a room. My room was the seclusion room. They didn't even give me a room. And I remember one time I went out on a pass. Actually, I went out on a pass and I had, I guess one time I had brought back pills or I had brought back a razor blade when I had gone out on a pass. And so when I came back, this nurse decided that she was going to do a strip search to see if I had brought anything back. And this was not legal. She took me in a locked bathroom. She took me in the bathroom of the room, locked the door, told me to get completely undressed, and she just did this incredible strip search. that I can't even think about because it was so horrifying. And the whole time she was doing this, she was telling me what a terrible person I was and what a terrible mother I was and how I was destroying my children. And it was one of the most traumatic events of my life. And years later, after being discharged from that hospital, years later, Jana Lee and I went back to that hospital and had a meeting with the whole board of psychiatrists and tried to tell them about what had happened. I wanted that nurse to be fired. What she had done was illegal. I had asked about strip searches and under what conditions could somebody be strip searched. And I got the documents from the hospital that there were very specific ways that a hospital could strip search a patient. And it had to be done with 2 nurses in a very particular setting and nothing like what she had done to me. And that was completely illegal. And they said, Jana Lee was with me, and they said that it never happened, that there were no notes about it in the chart, which of course was a joke. Of course, there were no notes about it in the chart. It was illegally done. Yeah. And they denied it, and they said that I was a psychiatric patient, and so what did I know? They denied that it had ever happened.
Right. I think this is such a good example of power over versus power with, in that setting where people are trying to do their best as healers, as helpers, but there becomes this power over. We know better than you, or we are even hiding things about the truth of what happened, versus what I feel like was one of the healing components for you, which was having power with Jack, having power with me in a way that there wasn't this exertion of something over you or some kind of dominance, and you learned also how to empower yourself. I felt like when we went to meet with that board, that there was some kind of empowerment, even though we didn't have much power in what they said or with the outcome of that, but you really wanted to go there. You wanted to express your discontent with how they treated you, and you wanted the head people to know what happened and what your experience was. So I think that was an important part of your journey. It was kind of reckoning with that power.
It was incredibly important. It was incredibly important that you believed me, that Dr. Green believed me, and that we went and talked with all of them. And I actually think they did not say that they necessarily believed it, but I really wonder about that.
Yeah, me too.
I don't know what happened as a result of it. I think something might have happened as a result of that. I guess I'll never know. But that terrible thing happened. And we told them, and you came with me and supported me. And that meant so much to me. That was incredible. We talked about it. We spent so much time planning that meeting and talking about what we were going to do and say and organizing it.
And you were really strong and really clear and really, really honest with
it was probably one of the most traumatic things in my life. What happened in that bathroom was something I'll never, ever forget. It was just a nightmare. Another thing was when I went out, I was not an easy person to deal with. I'm glad I never had to deal with anybody like me. And I'm not, criticizing I really, I'm glad I never had to deal with anyone like me. I don't know if I could have done any better, but I didn't choose to work with somebody like me.
I'd love to make a point about that.
Yeah.
It's kind of another twist in a way, which is, it's really clear how powerless you were in these kinds of situations. And then, I can't speak for Jen Lee, although I'm curious about one thing we hear stories of each other's work, but, Jen Lee and I mostly were separate from each other in the work. We'd have our separate times. But there were times that I would say in much smaller ways, the position you would put me in emotionally was kind of a way of saying, yeah, I'm going to do these things that are really dangerous and life-threatening and intense, and there's nothing you can do about it, Jack. You have no control. And I remember feeling like, yeah, that's right, actually, and like having to sit with the no control, like part of doing, what we call basic attendance with you. I had to really, really sit with like a really intense situations and feelings, and the underlying thing that went on, I would say for some years, was you needed to feel, in a way, you had power over me. It was a feeling of you had power over me, and there was nothing I could do except tolerate and keep showing up. And I think, in that way, it's not like the kind of Hollywood version of there's suddenly a breakthrough and an epiphany and everything resolves, like, some psychological drama. Yeah, mostly that isn't how it works. It was more like the long, slow, we could go on through a whole bunch of situations like that. And the one I'm thinking of is with you, Jenny, was some story of sitting in your car, I think at the end of a shift, just sobbing together, and a certain predicament and kind of a sense of like shared, not hopelessness, but here we are or something. And of course I'm projecting my memory of the story I've heard. But.
Yeah, I mean, there were many times in the car with Julia that I remember, and I do remember us sobbing together. I felt a lot of powerlessness, and because I wanted so much to help the situation, and like you said, Jack, all I knew to do was to kind of show up and try to work with my own nervous system so that I wouldn't be so wigged out that I wouldn't have anything to offer or be able to stay with Julia. And I do remember a lot of fear also coming up, because when I would show up, I wouldn't know from time to time whether Julia would be home or would be in the hospital or this. I remember having these visual memories of a big Russian roulette game kind of in the sky, and as I'm ringing the doorbell and thinking, where did the marble land, and is Julia going to be there or not? So I worked with a lot of fear and a lot of pain and around my care for Julia and wanting her to be all right. And yet, yeah, it was a long, we worked together for years, and it was a long road for sure. And then it came to one point where it was time for me to do something different with my life. And that might be the time when I was sobbing in the car with Julia. I don't remember, and saying goodbye, that it was time for me to do something different in my career even. And I went into a long retreat. So, yeah, I'm not exactly sure about that time you're mentioning, Jack, but that's what's coming to mind.
Right.
So we just made this journey through Julie talking about trauma, extremely traumatic things in the hospital. Obviously, generally, Jack, you were also experiencing this tremendously kind of powerful life and death situation, and you had the choice, of course, to quit. You wouldn't have to work together. And I remember I was involved at a distance. The feeling and acceptance. I think that's a term that's coming to mind for me, is accepting that, Julia, you might die in this process. You probably you may do it through the intentional use of pills. You may do it through accidentally cutting yourself in a way that you bleed out from, but that we were accepting the fact that you might die. So generally, that showing up and not knowing, and Jack, what you're talking about, and just riding in that place for quite some time. And I'd love to hear, Janely or Jack, anything more that you might have to say about how you experienced that and how you were able to stay with it.
Go for it, Jack.
I have to think about it.
I can get started and then you can jump in.
Yeah.
I remember these moments of brilliance, or as we call it in the business, brilliant sanity, that would just blossom out of Julia's mind and heart. There were times when you, Julia, touched me so deeply with your kindness to me, your compassion, your care about the homeless guy on the street that we might pass, your care about your children, your care about what was happening in the world. And that kept me going, because I trusted that if somehow we could hold the space, all of us, Dr. Green and you and Jack and myself, if we could all hold the space long enough, your brilliant intelligence and wonderfulness would just keep shining through in ways that accumulated, so that you wouldn't necessarily choose these other options as a way to relate. So I think that's what kept me going, something about, and your humor. You had such a kind of satirical, cynical sometimes humor, that, I don't know, I loved engaging with your mind and your heart. There was just something very, very deeply satisfying in my relationship with you that kept me going.
When I think of those years, I'm not sure I have some big noble view of what I was doing. I think I had done a decade of working with the homeless in all kinds of very intense situations. And then, ironically, I worked part-time in that locked psych unit, and then had left that probably 3 years before I met you, Julia. But I knew that world pretty well, and I'd been all over ER, the Boulder ERs and all this stuff. So honestly, I think it was, by that time, I didn't look far to the future with hope and things. I kind of had learned, you go toward the fire, you don't run away from it, in this work. And I was trying to be true to that, and you were also pretty determined, even though you and I had our moments, like we've said. You never canceled. You never, you never didn't show up. You really showed up, although, it wasn't always lovely, but you and I think we had some deep commitment to each other. I think maybe that's what kept me going. I was fully aware, and I think generally at times, early on let me know how serious this was, and how I think you were trying to prepare me gently in case Julia did die. And, so I think I just trusted both you and Chuck a great deal. And I trusted my relationship with Julia was whatever it was, and that I was not going to leave, So in a way, it was kind of it was simple in a certain way. It's like you stay with it, go toward the fire.
So being part of the system too, but distant. I didn't spend regular time with you, Julia, but generally you and I talked some. Jack more, I think, as years went on, and so the contact I had with you, it reminds me of what both you're saying. I was so impressed with this spark of absolute brilliance that I never lost track of. It was always so clearly there, and I had total confidence in that. I absolutely accepted the fact that you may die from what you're doing. It didn't feel like, even though, what you described, the powerlessness, Jack and Janely, sometimes you'd feel in terms of, I can't really impact this too much right now. I have to tolerate how I feel, but I feel like staying in touch. There's something about me that feels like staying in touch. And I think, Julie, the way you stayed in touch was so non-gamey and just straightforward, and it was your urges toward health that I always thought were really inspiring. I don't know. Yeah, it's kind of hard to. It's probably impossible to explain at this kind of a distance. But I just remember always feeling a warmth toward you and really appreciating a sort of fierce life force. It was palpable. Yeah.
I don't know. Sometimes I felt you were gaming with me. Like, it was the advent of the cell phone, and I remember sitting in Lucille's having lunch with you. And it was when people first started to have cell phones, and some guy was talking at the table next to us, and I remember you were just enraged that he was talking while we were having lunch, and you were like, if he doesn't get off his fucking cell phone, I'm going to get up, and like I was like, okay, this could be something, And I remember this feeling like, okay, I'm in a complete predicament here with you, and I think you were enjoying my predicament, and you were fully in control of the emotional space. I have to say, Chuck, that felt a little gamey.
Jack, you were there. I wasn't, and but I think maybe that I wasn't using exactly the correct term. Although that was my experience. But your commitment to showing up, I guess, is perhaps.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. So there was a commitment. I mean, a commitment to your process, and that's really compelling, because a lot of folks don't do that, and you did that. Let me ask a question here, Julia. How are you doing with this conversation?
I feel incredibly sad. I feel incredibly sad. I feel like I guess I never realized how there are a lot of people I don't really care if I hurt them. I don't really care about. I don't know. I mean, I never really would want to hurt anybody intentionally, but I really love both of you so much that it really hurts me to think that I hurt you both so much.
But I don't.
Made your lives so difficult.
But I disagree. I don't think I've been hurt by people. I don't feel like you ever hurt me. Being in these intense predicaments together, that's not being hurt. I don't know. What do you think of that?
Maybe that's not the right word, but
yeah, I don't feel like I was hurt or harmed by you.
Me neither.
It's not the right word, but it just makes me so sad that
Well, we were, part of our work and our training is to go into it with you, and we were, part of being close to you is to be in the predicaments that you were in, and that's what we were doing. There's no way we could have done it any other way. I mean, and that's part of, we, you don't get to stay a safe distance in this work if you're really showing up. You enter in, and I think both Janalee and I and Chuck entered in, and that's that. But that's with full awareness, full attention, and there's no harm in that. That's us doing what we do and what we choose to do.
No, I understand that. I'm just trying to remember how I felt during those times, how I felt about you both, and did I think about what you were experiencing? I'm just trying to remember. I'm sure that I did. I don't know. I just know that for me, being able to go through those times with you both and with Dr. Green allowed me to come out on the other end. And I don't think I could have otherwise. Whatever happened during those periods of time that we shared made it possible for me to come out of it.
Julia, I want to ask, you just started into something there that I think is really a key point. And I hear and feel the sadness too of just kind of being in that space with the predicament that you were all in. It was, and people who were able to accept and stay connected to you. It was everybody was feeling it. And it's tough to survive this kind of stuff. It's tough to, it's not even easy to maintain therapeutic relationships. These were real relationships, and they had the therapeutic component. But then, so how do you think you survived this?
I think a lot of things helped me to survive. In spite of all of the negative things that happened, I had a lot of wonderful things that happened. My sister, for one thing, my sister and I never had much of a relationship growing up. My younger sister, she's 2 years older than me, we never had a relationship growing up at all. And when all of these crazy things started happening to me, my sister and I developed a relationship in a way. My sister was able to help me financially, and without that help, you guys wouldn't have happened. Dr. Green wouldn't have happened. A lot of things wouldn't have happened, and so I wouldn't be here without that. In addition to that kind of help, over the years, my sister and I became friends in a lot of ways. We talk to each other a lot on the phone, and we've developed a relationship with each other that's more than her helping me financially. We become sisters, and she we really share things now, even though we never had much of a relationship at all growing up. And so she helped me tremendously. I was talking to her last night on the phone, and I remembered a situation where I had taken a whole bunch of pills. My children were downstairs, my ex-husband was downstairs, and I just overdosed terribly. I mean, with everybody in my family downstairs. And I was overdosed so severely that I probably would have died with my whole family downstairs, not knowing a thing. And my sister happened to just call on the phone. And the phone was right next to the bed, and I picked up the phone, kind of, just answered it, rang right in my ear. And my sister heard that I was like, totally out of it and couldn't speak. And she put her husband on the phone, and she told him to just keep me talking. She didn't know that anyone was home. And she's told her husband, just keep me talking, keep me awake. And she proceeded to call the police in Boulder and ambulances and all kinds of people in Boulder. And, she didn't live in Colorado. And the police came to my house and broke down the door. And my husband and 3 kids were there, and they didn't know anything. She saved my life. And, just all of these memories of things things that had happened over the years with my sister. And so my sister has always been there for me and provided things that I couldn't have had otherwise, financial things. My friend, certainly from when I was 7, she's been my best friend all of my life. It still is my best friend. And that has been a huge support for me always. And so, that's been a wonderful support. So having those people in my life, and Dr. Green and you guys, and those things have been the most important things that have gotten me through that time period in my life. I couldn't have gotten through it otherwise. There would be no way I could have gotten through it. So I was very lucky that I had those things available to me. I don't think that that's available to most people. So I was very, very lucky to have that.
Julia, you didn't name a medication saved me, a particular place saved me, or something like that. You named your sister, Dr. Green, Janley, Jack. You named relationships. That it was actually, they kept you somehow in some way that allowed you to survive.
Yes. And that's definitely what it was. I certainly don't think it was medication. I think in many ways medication was very harmful to me, and I think we'll probably talk about medication. I don't know what else you mentioned. Places didn't help me. Hospitals, for the most part, didn't help me. I think maybe they were helpful in keeping me alive at certain times.
Yeah.
I think that that's true. I think they were helpful in keeping me alive, but at the same time, they caused a great deal of damage as well.
I think there were times, just practically, that I'm glad you said that about hospitals, because they may not have been a change factor, but there would be a timeout, a break. I seem to remember, it was at times very intense for team members and for Dr. Green, and I seem to remember, there'd be times where it was like, you need a timeout, you need to cool down, you're getting more and more dangerous, and with yourself, and having a period of time in the hospital. And there were times you had relationships with some of the people in the hospital, and you went to different hospitals that you would report were very good, that there was I'm remembering some orderly type guy who you.
Yes, that's right.
Like was it West Pines or something? Who you thought?
That's right. I did have
again a relationship in a psych hospital. So
I did, that's right. There was one person that I remember was so kind.
Mm-hmm.
Most people were so regimented and would say, no, you can't have coffee now, it's not 8 o'clock. Coffee doesn't come out until 8 a.m. and it's 7:45. So, there were just, so many rules and regulations, there was just no humanity. I remember waking up in the middle of the night. I had a terrible nightmare, a horrifying nightmare where people were burning the bottom of my feet, and I was terrified. And I ran out and wanted to talk with someone, and the nurse said, "Go back to sleep, and you can talk about it in the morning." Mm-hmm. And it was like, God, here I am in a hospital. I'm like freaking out about this horrifying nightmare, and here this person tells me, go back to sleep, you can talk about it in the morning. It just seemed so wrong for them to do that, and along comes this orderly, or I don't know, he was an aide of someone, and he said, sit down, let's talk about it. And he was the kindest person. And we just, talked for a few minutes, but he was just so kind and compassionate. And I just remember that, we didn't talk for a long time, but it was just such a different way of relating than other people had related. And he stayed with me in my memory and in yours, I guess, Chuck. I must have told you him.
Well, I'm pretty sure I came to visit you in that, and I remember coming in, and they'd always want to talk to you, me before and after I visited you. So I talked with them, and they were kind of freaked out by you, and you weren't talking to anybody, and they were scared of you. And then I went in with you, and I was like, okay, brace yourself. Julia's in a state. And I walked in, and you were just your ordinary self. You weren't, like, between you and me, it was like, oh, yeah, you're fine. Like, what are you doing in here anyway? And I think I told them as much as I left. And this might be the time that, I think by the time I got home, you were already back. Like, somehow you got out in the blink of an eye. You were like in a taxi, and they rocketed you home. But you could sometimes, those hospitals, they could be really, like, they could save you if you were in a really suicidal, really focused period. And also, staying in there long wasn't a good idea. It's kind of, you'd start to fight with them. You'd get in these just terrific power struggles with the staff.
I think that I was just put in hospitals all too often, and it wasn't necessary.
Mm-hmm. There's so many reasons why people end up in the hospital. Sometimes it's very useful to break a rhythm somebody's in and keep somebody safe. And sometimes people are liability-wise putting people in the hospital because they don't want to take a risk with something. They don't know enough to take a risk, or it's just not doesn't seem feasible, But it's definitely, just coming back to what we were talking about earlier, in that point about what got you through this, you have very clear memories of the relationship aspect of this. And in terms of just this story and this section of your story, I think people lose track of how important relationships are sometimes, and the continuity of them, and the accepting aspects of them. So I'm really glad this came out, and this is, I think, a really perfect example of how people oftentimes survive these stages of life and stages of recovery through relationship.
Mm-hmm. And especially when other relationships were ending or falling apart, like the divorce of your husband. It seemed like, the contrast of having certain relationships that were stable and ongoing, and then the dissolution of other relationships, that contrast was somehow very impactful.
Absolutely. At that time, when I think at the time when you guys came into my life, I was just starting to go through a divorce. Mm-hmm. Isn't that right?
That's right.
Mm-hmm. And I had...
Everybody had just moved out at that point. I think you were living alone suddenly for the first time.
Right. And I had just found out about the fact that my husband had been having an affair for a while, and I knew nothing about it. And Dr. Green, he had come with me to a meeting, and Dr. Green somehow, I don't know how he knew, but he asked him if he was seeing another person, and he said yes. And it was a total shock to me. I don't know why Dr. Green thought about asking him that. I don't know what made him think about that. But it was a total shock to me. It was a student of his, an ex-student, actually, somebody that had been a student of his in the past. And I had no idea at all. And so that was extremely upsetting. And then that led to, I think we would have gotten divorced anyway. Things were really bad. But that led to him moving out and the whole divorce. The divorce was extremely difficult for me to deal with. I was having a very hard time staying alive. And then all of a sudden I was alone. My kids had gone off to school and they were not living at home. And I was alone and I couldn't manage anything. I couldn't survive, couldn't do anything. And so that was a very hard time.
So back to your sister, Dr. Green, Jack Chanley, that kind of relational stability through that time was
Exactly.
completely key.
Right.
I don't know if this will make sense, but sometimes I think your anger kept you alive. Like that actually when your husband at the time, your ex-husband now, moved out, he became this person you could get really mad at. And there was periods of time where you could focus it. And there's something about, you could get really mad. I sit here and experience how, kind of gracious and great you are right here as we talk. And there were times you were red hot furious. And I think that you needed that, there were times in our relationship you were red hot furious with me, and I think you needed that. You can't take that away from a person. And I think that your ability to be furious at outside people gave you somewhere to put that instead of, back on yourself. I see it as you kind of turned this really intense rage that you were able to cut really seriously on yourself, and you found ways to put it out there. And, I think that was a really important part of maybe the energy shift that you went through. And eventually when you could get it out there, then it started to dissipate. And there were definitely shifts that followed in your kind of path as I experienced them. So
I would agree that anger, I would say even, I would put along with anger feistiness. There was a feistiness and a real desire to live, even though there were all these obstacles getting in the way of that. But I also remember in the beginning with you, Julia, that anger was new to you. I remember saying, gosh, I would be so angry if that happened to me. And you were like, really? Wow. I mean, it seemed new to you at the very beginning of our work. And then over time, and this was, again, just my take on it, but then over time, you started to kind of really feel and allow that anger to be okay and not something bad. And that does seem like a healing part when you were able to own that that outrage actually at what had happened to you, whether it was in the hospital setting or with the psychiatrist who molested you or before that. I would agree that anger had energy, vitality to it.
I understand what you're saying. I don't remember ever feeling angry growing up. I remember feeling a lot of depression and becoming very obsessive, but I don't remember ever feeling angry at anyone or anything.
Right. I think it was a new.
I remember being very depressed.
Yeah. I think the anger, like Jack was saying, kind of went in at you instead of seeing it as, hey, wait a minute, I'm being mistreated here. Or, I don't like this.
Yeah.
Thank you for listening to Windhorse Journal Entry 75. We hope you tune in next month for part 3 of this 5-part series that dives even further into the healing path of relational medicine that this team explored together.
Windhorse Journal is a publication of Windhorse Community Services, supporting recovery from mental health challenges at home and in the community since 1981.